May the words of my mouth, may the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So for the second Sunday in a row, in our lectionary, kind of the prescribed readings for Sundays, there is a parable in Matthew's gospel about someone sowing seeds. Last week, while I was away, if you are in church, you heard the story of the sower who threw seed kind of everywhere. Took all kinds of different soil, on rocky soil, thorny soil, threw seeds on the path and on the good soil. And then today we have another parable where it says someone sowed seed in a field. And then it says that the enemy came along at night and sowed weeds. And the weeds and the wheat come up together. They grow side by side. And when the servants see this, they ask the master, hey, don't you want us to go out and pull all the weeds? The master, being a wise master, says no. Because if you pull the weeds, you will uproot the wheat, the good plants, along with them. He says, what we're going to do is we're going to wait. We're going to be patient until the harvest. And then it will be obvious, and we'll sort it all out. I love this. I love this parable. Can't really say I like the second half of the reading for today, where there's all this like kind of explanation about the actual parable. It's interesting in Matthew's gospel, that second part, most scholars think that was probably addressing some very specific conflict in the early church. And I don't know, form your own opinions about that, but that sounds a little fire and brimstone to my modern ears. But this first part, the first part we have, the actual parable, it's like, wow. Think about the weeds and the wheat growing up together. I mean, that sounds like the world that I know, kind of in every way, right? And so what does this parable of weeds and wheat, the good and the bad growing side by side, what does that have to say about our complex, our confusing world that we find ourselves in? What does it say about weeds and wheat in our personal lives, in our inner lives? What does this say about us and our place and our role in kind of trying to help sort it all out, to fix? And what does this say about how God sees it? It is for certain that the way the world works, like this parable, where the weeds and the wheat, the good and evil, they come up and they exist side by side. And not only are they side by side in this parable, as it suggests, but their roots, it says, their roots are intertwined. I mean, like, isn't that a great metaphor? It's like below the surface, it's all twisted together, right? There's this tangle of motivation, tangled in tension. And it's all twisted and it's giving life to the good wheat and the bad wheat. When you look at this parable a little closer, it says, when the plants came up and bore grain, it was then, only then, that the weeds and the wheat kind of appeared obvious, right? And so it's only after they come up and after they bear fruit that we can distinguish weed from wheat. Before that, you can't really tell. The two plants apparently looked exactly the same. And so it's a fairly common thought that this weed in Matthew's gospel What he's referring to here is a weed called darnel or cockle, which is this very noxious weed that looks exactly like wheat, and it grows all over Israel, apparently. And so the only way you can tell the difference between the wheat from the weed, the darnel from the wheat, is when they grow, the wheat will get heavy, and it'll droop over. And then the darnel will be standing up straight. And it's only then that you can tell them apart. So I think this is a really interesting and helpful idea to play with. That the only way you can tell the wheat from the weed is by the fruit that they produce. Before that, we just can't tell. I think generally when we think about it, we humans, we kind of get confused around what is wheat and what is weed. What is good and acceptable in one place, what is wheat in one place, is not in another. It depends a lot of the time on our context, on our perspective, I think. So like, for example, in our backyard, we have a couple of raised beds, right? Out in the lawn, right? So there's grass, lawn, and then these raised beds. And the grass that's growing all over the yard, that is not a weed in the lawn, right? The weeds are the little violets and the clover or whatever is growing in there, right? But that very same grass, when it gets into our raised bed, then it becomes the weed, right? And we pull it out. Sometimes. We're not good at weeding. But I think the truth of the matter is we are not nearly as good at telling wheat from weed as we think we are. Our vision is shaped always by our own perspective, our own experience, and by the context. Our judgments are almost always conditioned by where we're standing. And so it's God alone. It's God alone that sees the whole field, the big picture. Another thing, this is interesting, that this parable points out strongly, is that we have a tendency to try to rush in and pull weeds and fix problems with that limited perspective before we understand the whole problem and the ramifications. And that, I think, is precisely where we see again and again how our limited perspective of the problem can become even harmful. So last week, Catherine McAdams, one of the youth in our parish, and I were with the Camp Henry Outdoor School. This is a ministry of the Episcopal Church where you go backpacking. We were out for like 5 days, and then we have a couple days of climbing, a day of whitewater rafting. Wonderful program. It was great. But last Sunday, while you guys were here, Catherine and I were climbing up a mountain called Pilot Mountain. She remembers. It was hard. She's nodding her head. It's not the Pilot Mountain you might be thinking of. This one's out near Brevard, in between the Parkway there and Brevard. But the view from the top is incredible. It's incredible. But what I personally got most excited about up there was it was a stand of American chestnut trees, mature American chestnuts that were up there. It's like I'm looking at the trees, kids are looking at the view. They thought I was crazy, but it's like these things are rare, people. If you know the story of the American chestnut, you just know how rare that is, because in the first part of the 20th century, a blight came in and began killing all the chestnut trees. Before the blight, the chestnut was a dominant tree in the canopy. It was like all over the place, like oaks. And so kind of like how in our parable the weeds grow and choke the good plants, the blight comes along. It's a fungus from Asia. It grows at the base of the chestnut, and it splits the bark open, and eventually it chokes the tree. And so they're all dead. So the blight comes to America, and what do? We begin to cut down all the chestnut trees for lumber. People were like, well, if they're going to die anyway, we might as well salvage this wood. So we cut down all the chestnuts. But now what we know is that there are these rare cases, these rare stands of fairly blight-resistant chestnut trees out there, like the ones on top of Pilot Mountain. And so what scientists speculate is, had we not rushed in, jumped the gun, and cut down all the chestnuts for lumber, there's a good chance they would have come back. They would have mutated, they would have evolved, they would have crossbred and become blight-resistant. I think all too often we sacrifice wisdom in the name of a quick fix. And this parable today reminds us of that very human trait. Sometimes our greatest mistakes come from acting too quickly on what we think we know. That is why Jesus says, be patient. Wait. Consult the master gardener. Consult God. Let God sort it out. Let God's judgment, God's wisdom, let God's timing figure it out. The Episcopal priest, she's also an author, Barbara Brown Taylor, she writes, I love this, she writes that what God ultimately cares about is growth. She writes that growth interests God way more than perfection, and that God is willing to risk fat weeds for fat wheat. She says, when we try to help pull them out, even a little, to improve on his plan, he lets us know that our timing is off, not to mention our judgment, and that he does, in fact, after all, own the field. How very true. How very true. So there's one more last little piece that I want to add here. And that is that the weeds and the wheat are not just growing out there in the world, in this crazy, confusing world we live in. The wheat and the weeds are inside of us. This is something that a priest named Jim Abbott told me a long time ago. He said our lives and our souls are like gardens. He said they're like gardens that we tend to and that we ask God to tend to. And he said they're weeds inside us. And those are the hurts, those are the pains, the habits, the flaws. And that those are growing right beside the good plants in our garden. He said our tendency is to want to just rush in and to yank out the weeds, get rid of the flaws right now. He said, but we have to be gentle with ourselves. Growth takes time. We have to be patient, he said. He said, pull the weeds gently. And then Father Abbott, he said this. He said, then we compost them right back into the soil. They become compost. So that they're still a part of our garden, part of us. They haven't gone anywhere, but now they are providing nutrients instead of stealing the nutrients from the good plants in our life. So there it is. There it is. In this world and in our souls, the weeds and the wheat grow side by side. And that's why we do this. That is why we come here. So that we learn to put our faith and our trust in the master gardener. That is our hope that we carry for the world. That is a good news that we have to share. Amen.